Welcome to Adventures in Theater History. Here on this show, we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm Peter Schmitz, and our sound engineering and original theme music are by Christopher Mark Colucci. In this episode, we continue the story of the Theater of the Living Arts on South Street during the 1960s. If you haven't heard episode 54, in which we started this story, I would suggest you go back and find it first, of course. It will help make everything we're discussing here today and in the next show make more sense. But, wait a minute. Many of you faithful listeners are no doubt saying right now, Peter, did you just say the next show? Did you not tell us that you would wrap up this whole story and round out season 2? Well, I did. Yes, I did. And believe me, I have tried to do that. I did not want to do another 3-part investigation, which seems to have become the pattern that every story we've told this season has fallen into. It was my clear intention, I swear, 2 weeks ago to make this a 2-parter. And by the end of June, slap together one big grand package and make a great season finale, tie up the storyline of the TLA, and even make some larger observations about the themes of scandal, censorship, and conflict in Philly theater that we've been talking about for the last 9 months. But, as I also said in our last episode, number 55, sometimes I make mistakes. And boy, was that one of them. As I have been working away this week, I just got to the point where I realized that I was not doing the right thing by the material. I was not really serving the narrative that I needed to tell. And by cramming everything into one show, it was either going to balloon into a huge 90-minute extravaganza, which I did not want to do, or I would have to ruthlessly cut and remove all sorts of interesting and important elements of the story, and I did not want to do that either. Well, I should have known. I suppose that's what has usually happened in the past when I've been putting together deep dives into fascinating topics. I end up saying, well, we're just going to have to cut this and make it into a separate episode. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. So anyway, that's quite enough talk about process. I won't bore you with any more. I'll just say that we will call this episode a middle, that is to say, part 2, and as soon as I can, I will be researching, writing, and recording and releasing the finale, which of course we will entitle The End. Because that's what we all really want to know. Why does the Theater of Living Arts fail? Why is it not, at this very moment, as we speak, the flagship regional theater in the city of Philadelphia, the equivalent to the Guthrie in Minneapolis or the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C.? We'll get closer to answering that question today. We just won't get all the way there. By the time we finish today, we'll reach the summer of 1966, when there will be both enormous optimism for this young Philadelphia theater company and the very beginnings of what would prove to be a fatal conflict, the aftershocks of which can still be felt today. In the end, when we get there, many would say the whole story proves that maybe Philadelphia's audiences were just hopelessly provincial and they were not ready to support great art at all. And if that was true, that was a remark that would cut very deeply into Philadelphia's psyche, because for years the city had been accused of being hopelessly sleepy, and a lot of folks used that deadly word, provincial. That was precisely the image Philly was trying to escape. To give us a little more perspective, let's look at the story of another reaction in Philly to another great theater artist right around that time, and it's one that some of our listeners might recognize. In the year 1964, Great Britain's Royal Shakespeare Company came on a tour through Philadelphia, booked into the grand old Schubert Theater on Broad Street next to the Academy of Music, and they brought with them a production of King Lear, starring Paul Schofield and Irene Worth. The director of this Lear was Peter Brook. Indeed, Brook had even designed the set and the props for this production, with rusty iron panels walling in the mostly bare stage, which was decorated only with battered tankards, swords, and wooden stool. This was a real, artistic, up-to-date, modern approach to Shakespeare. For its week-long run in Philadelphia, the company performed this great tragedy in rotation with a lighter piece, The Comedy of Errors, which was directed by Clifford Williams. Schofield and Irene Worth rested on the nights that Comedy of Errors was playing, but the rest of the company, including Diana Rigg, Ian Richardson, Alec McCowan, Brian Murray, Barry McGregor, and Julie Christie, all pitched in. Now, leaving Comedy of Errors aside, Philadelphia newspaper critics were ecstatic about King Lear, and they praised both Paul Schofield's acting and Peter Brook's direction, which they termed majestic, magnificent, and electrifying. Run, don't walk to the box office to catch the one-week engagement, advised Inquirer reviewer Henry Murdoch, and he gave Schofield credit for, quote, providing one of those experiences which restore a reverence for the craft of the player. Wow. But the broader population of regular Philadelphia audience members had found this King Lear to be a bit of a trial, frankly. As Peter Brook had directed it, the first intermission of the show did not come for almost 2 hours, which was a long set, and the second half of the evening was almost as long again. In addition, Philadelphia Daily News reviewer Jerry Gagan noted that many in the audience strained to understand the accents of the British actors. One night, a squalling baby had even interrupted the show. The mother of this baby attempted to mollify it with a bottle, but that didn't work, and eventually, embarrassed, the mother had left her seat, took the baby home, explained to the Schubert's house management that she'd been unable to find a sitter for the evening, and other people had left, sleepy and yawning, at the intermission. The show was simply too long, they said, and they were going home to bed. Peter Brook wrote later about this dispiriting 1964 experience in his famous and influential book about modern theater, The Empty Space. He compared the performances of Lear at the Schubert in Philadelphia to the enthusiastic reception the production had previously received from European audiences who did not even necessarily quite understand the early modern English of the text. Here's what he says in his book, quote, in Philadelphia, the audience understood English all right, but this audience was composed largely of people who were not interested in the play. People who came for all the conventional reasons, because their wives insisted, and so on. Undoubtedly, a way existed to involve this particular audience in King Lear, but it was not our way. The austerity of the production, which had seemed so right for Europe, no longer made sense. Seeing people yawn, I felt guilty, realizing something else was demanded from us all. I knew, were I doing a production of King Lear for the people of Philadelphia, I would, without condescension, stress everything differently, and in immediate terms, I would get it to work better. Now, that's a very interesting quote, and it's important to note that Brook used this story not to disparage Philadelphia or to judge Philadelphia theater goers, but to illustrate his point that the theatrical event as a complete experience is always necessarily composed of fragile, changeable elements, not the least of which is the audience. I think we can safely assume that it was largely this same Philadelphia audience, demographically speaking, that also would form the majority of the folks who eventually found their way to the Theater of the Living Arts in 1965 and 66. I can see that from photographs of the audience that I can find in the archives. On the whole, they were middle class, were well-dressed. These were folks who went to the theater regularly, and this theater-going habit had likely been part of their lives ever since childhood. They were also, and again, I'm judging from photographs, almost exclusively white. Black and other minority theater artists and theater patrons in the city were not much considered. I'm sorry to say I just don't see anything in the records of the TLA about them. In fact, This was precisely the point in time when Philadelphia's own black arts-inspired theater groups got underway, because there had only been faint efforts by the white establishment of Philadelphia to include them at all in this new theater. So put a pin in that. This is definitely a topic we're going to directly address in future episodes. Anyway, this white middle-class Philadelphia audience, this was regarded by many at the time as the proven and accepted target audience for serious new theater. These were the folks that had been supporting the tryout productions that came to Philadelphia during the 40s and 50s, but had begun to feel abandoned after serious non-musical Broadway and off-Broadway productions increasingly skipped Philadelphia in the early 60s. These were folks who were ready to see plays. Though, admittedly, some of them, as Peter Brook phrased it, came for all the conventional reasons, their wives insisted, and so forth. But we should not make the mistake, because certainly Brook did not, of thinking that none of them were interested in serious intellectual theater and artistic endeavor. After all, here's what the TLA's founders had stated in the very start, in their initial brochures. Quote, "The producing committee is devoted to theater as an art form and as a vital part of civilized life." This is what Celia Silverman and Jean Goldman, the two women who had really gotten the ball rolling in founding a nonprofit regional theater for Philadelphia, this is what they had always wanted. In fact, they were quite clear. They wanted to found a theater that would be like the Hedgerow. Go back and listen to our episode about that, if you can, out in Rose Valley. But the TLA would be larger and would be in an urban setting rather than in a bucolic suburban context, like Jasper Dieter had preferred. Silverman and Goldman were interested in staging Brecht and Shakespeare and Molière and Shaw and O'Neill, just as Jasper Dieter had done. But they also wanted to explore modern playwrights, and they wanted to use Philadelphia actors and designers as part of this community. But certainly they didn't want to put people to sleep. They didn't want to send them home early, and they didn't want to attack their sensibilities. And on the whole, Andre Gregory was totally on board with that. And I really should mention here that in my reporting and research of this story, I am relying heavily on a document written in 1991 by Patricia McLaughlin. It was prepared for a meeting of LMDA, the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. It really is an amazing resource. I found it in the collection of the Free Library of Philadelphia. Though McLaughlin didn't have the same access to the quick power searches that I can do these days in newspaper archives, she really went into the available physical historical archives here and in New York, and most impressively, she went out and interviewed and talked to almost all the major participants in the story, including Andre Gregory, the Goldmans and the Silvermans, many members of the acting company, including Lois Smith and Jerry Dempsey, and the other artistic staff of the theater. She even got Adam Gopnik, who, as you recall, was just a boy at the time, to talk about his childhood experiences at the TLA. These were interviews that I could not possibly have done myself. I'm so grateful for them. First, I don't have that kind of access. And second, although many of these major participants are still around, it's 60 years on, many people that I have gotten in touch with have sort of sighed and said, well, it was all so long ago. But Patricia McLaughlin really caught them at just the right time. In the early 90s, it was 3 decades on, and many of the old passions and resentments had faded, and people had some perspective, and the people she talked to were quite nostalgic and philosophical and could see how what had happened at the TLA all fit into the larger experience of their lives and their artistic careers. The only people who did not really seem interested in talking to her, I note, were the former board members of the TLA, many of whom had been left holding the financial bag in the final breakup of the organization. It was nothing they wanted to revisit, evidently, even for history's sake. When we last left the story, in January of 1965, Andre Gregory's production of the Brecht play Galileo had just opened the TLA's very first season. Now, even though Galileo was a rather long and intellectually challenging night of the theater, just like King Lear had been, there was much goodwill left behind for the TLA's next show, which were both modern translations of old French plays. Interestingly, first there was Tiger at the Gates, Christopher Fry's adaptation of the Jean Giraudoux play, which in English translates to The Trojan War Will Not Take Place. And then there was a production of the 17th century play, Molière's The Misanthrope. Misanthrope, let's use the American pronunciation, was a show that really showed the newly formed resident Southwark Acting Company, as they called themselves, at their best. The director of the play was Gregory L. Sherman, who by all accounts was a delight to work with, and he really got everybody relaxed about performing in verse. He had chosen Richard Wilbur's then brand new translation, which kept the rhyming couplets of the original French, but used a modern American vocabulary and locutions. Sherman and the designer, Robert Darling, employed modern clothing and furniture too, with the men in the cast wearing sport coats and the women wearing high styles, 1960s American fashions. Ron Liebman as Alceste, the title character who insists on virtue and candor from everyone, no matter the social cost, drew enormous praise from local critics, as did Lois Smith, who played his lover, Célimène, and also in the company were Jerry Dempsey, Sally Kirkland, and Estelle Parsons, who had come in from New York just for this show. The Inquirer's Henry Murdoch wrote that the Misanthrope's intrinsic wit and humor were well served by Sherman's light and fast-paced direction, and the Daily News's Jerry Gagan said it could be considered the highlight of the entire Philadelphia theatrical season. The production got national attention too, as the influential magazine, the Saturday Review, sent critic Henry Cruz, who wrote that it was fascinatingly adventurous. Andre Gregory, for his part, was so pleased that he invited Sherman to join the company as associate artistic director for the next season, which Sherman agreed to do. Everything was going very well. The board of the Theater of the Living Arts was quite pleased, and they gave Andre Gregory a 3-year extension on his initial contract. And Gregory moved his family from a rental on Delancey Street near Rittenhouse Square to a new home in Society Hill so that he could be closer to the theater at all times. At a cocktail party he hosted before he moved to the other side of town, he declared that looking back on the past few months, it had been a difficult but a marvelous year. And he boasted that there were now 7,000 regular subscribers for the theater, and he expected it to double for the next year. They told us at first Philadelphia wouldn't back good plays and would never go to South Street to look at them, he told the assembled guests. But soon enough, he predicted, the theater would grow and would have a new and even larger home and would someday rival the Philadelphia Orchestra itself as the premier performing arts institution in town. For the final offering of the season, Gregory took the directing reins again himself with a production of Samuel Beckett's Endgame. The acting company's David Hurst, who had earlier starred in Galileo, was playing Ham, and Ron Liebman was Clove, both men dressed as clowns. Jerry Dempsey and the actress Miriam Phillips played the parents, Nag and Nell, cruelly crammed into barrels for most of the evening, as Beckett had instructed. Now, Endgame is a famously difficult text. Its allusions to the end of the world and the Book of Revelations require a lot of erudition to fully comprehend, and although by 1965 people were beginning to accept the demanding conventions of absurdist drama, it was nothing new. If any play was going to drive Philadelphians screaming out of the theater, this was it. Gregory was going all out. In fact, according to Gregory's 1991 interview with McLaughlin, 30 years later, this was the first play he had ever done that just reached out and grabbed him and obsessed him. In fact, his attitude became, he said that, quote, I knew that it wasn't Beckett who wrote this play. I wrote the play. I somehow mysteriously needed Samuel Beckett, but really it was a complete expression of my own self. And it was the story of my own life and my family and the way I felt about the world, my childhood, everything. It just got me. This was the first production that Gregory collaborated on with the designer Eugene Lee. They created a set in which a steel and mesh cube was constructed on stage, and it was lit from within. There was a thin screen, in fact, in front of the cube, which slightly obscured the view of the stage from the audience and certainly kept the actors from seeing out into the house. David Hurst, as the blind and crippled Ham, had put blacked-out glasses on, so literally he couldn't see anything anyway, and Ron Liebman, as Clove, was never allowed to sit down, which was a real physical trial, given the discomfort of the metal grating that Eugene Lee placed on the floor. But Andre Gregory gave both actors free rein to find all the mordant comedy they could in Beckett's bleak lines. And the two actors ran with it. They responded with a flurry of impressions and voices, from Betty Davis to Bert Lahr to Cyril Richard to the recently assassinated President John F. Kennedy. It was a real tour de force performance. And again, there was wide praise from both local critics and the larger American theater world. But although many in the Philadelphia audience had been left rather bewildered by Endgame, nobody walked out. Well, they couldn't, because during the 2-hour show, as Gregory directed it, there was no intermission. By the fall of 1965, the second Theater of Living Arts season was underway. The repertoire again was mostly of European playwrights, but that was very much in line with what other American regional theaters were doing in that era. Chekhov, Sheridan, Strindberg, Ennui. Most encouragingly, by this time, the resident acting company had really gelled into a cohesive unit with a common vocabulary and a way of working. There were some changes. George Sherman, as we mentioned, was now the associate artistic director, and he was a warm and gregarious presence in rehearsals and at social events. Though extremely respected, of course, Andre Gregory was somewhat more distant and intellectual in his affect, and as he himself later recalled, it felt like sometimes he was the father and George Sherman was the mother figure in the company. Fred Goldman, one of the four initial founders of the whole enterprise, had come back, and he had stepped in to become the chair of the TLA board. In fact, he was also acting as its financial advisor, as well as running the PCPA, the organization which still held title to the theater itself, and sponsored the concerts, the films, and the dance recitals, which took place in the space during times that plays were not being staged there. Goldman was determined, however, to keep a firm hand on the TLA's finances. He didn't really trust the managing director, David Lunney, who he felt was too deferential to Gregory's free-spending and artistically freewheeling ways. Lunney was running an apprentice program, bringing in young people from the Philadelphia community, and he was even hiring new personnel, including carpenters, technicians, and prop masters. One of the apprentices, who was soon working for the TLA at this time, was a young Philadelphian named Stuart Finkelstein, a graduate of Central High School. Finkelstein had left Temple University Theater Program after his first semester there in order to get real theater experience working backstage at the TLA with this exciting new group. And there he met Mary Kay Bernardo, who had just been recruited from Cleveland, Ohio, to run the prop department at TLA at what she regarded as a gratifyingly generous salary. "I was probably the highest paid prop person in the country," she later admitted. Andre Gregory was developing the reputation of spending what he needed to spend and worrying about the consequences later. Fred Goldman's proposed solution was to give each of the 5 plays in the TLA season exactly 1/5 of the annual budget, and only releasing the money exactly when each of the 5 plays was scheduled to begin rehearsals. As you might expect, this led to increasing tension with Gregory, who felt that he needed flexibility in order to pursue his artistic ends. And increasingly, the board president, who had more operational control, Thomas Fleming, was taking Gregory's side in these disputes and not Goldman's. I should also mention that during this second season of the TLA, Gene Goldman and Celia Silverman were no longer listed as producers of each play in the program credits, nor do their names pop up in any more newspaper articles about the institution, at least not that I can find. Though for the moment, the 2 women remained on the board, and they had some say in the selection of repertoire. These 2 women, who had done so much to get the TLA started, seemed in fact to have been mostly sidelined by Gregory in any other active role in the running of the place. As far as the season itself, it's perhaps significant to note that Gregory opened with directing Uncle Vanya, a text that he would return to famously many years later on 42nd Street in New York. Sherman followed with a delightfully zany production for the holidays of Sheridan's The Critic, the well-loved spoof on 18th century theater practices, much in the style that used to be done in the long-ago Southwark Theater in Philadelphia's colonial days, just up the street. Actor Ron Liebman, by now well established as the young leading man of the company, got the plum role of Mr. Puff. The most famous show of that second season, however, in Philadelphia theater lore, was Andre Gregory's production of Jean Anouilh's play, Pour Bitos. This play had been mounted in both Paris and London a few years earlier and subsequently on Broadway in 1964, but nowhere had it been a real commercial success. Pour Bitos is set at a dinner party in post-World War II France. The title character is a remorseless prosecutor charged with investigating collaborators with the Nazis during the recent war. Halfway through the action of the play, Bitos is shot by one of the guests, or at least everyone thinks he is shot, and the rest of the play is mostly a hallucinatory vision by Bitos in which he imagines himself transformed back to the 18th century and is contending with historical characters from the French Revolution. It was a scathing, dark comedy about the hypocrisies of the ruling classes of the world, as well as the heartless sanctimony of powerful people who regard themselves as being on the cutting edge of history. It was exactly the sort of thing that was in Andre Gregory's wheelhouse, although Fred Goldman might say it had a lot of ironic resonances for him as well. During rehearsals, Gregory played jazz and rock music to accompany movement and improvisation exercises, and a lot of this material made it into the final product, including an orgy scene in which actors writhed together passionately on the floor. The biggest technical challenge made by Anouilh's script is that transformation moment after the shooting. A modern upper-class French dining room must suddenly change in an instant into a bare 18th century council chamber in almost a cinematic quick cut. But because, after all, the TLA space was one of those newfangled thrust stages, there were no curtains to cover a set change, unlike all other previous productions of the play. Furthermore, Gregory, who was once again working with Eugene Lee, had created a set with a drastic rake on the floor so that it angled steeply towards the audience, and nothing could be rolled off into the wings, which were almost non-existent anyway. Indeed, the two men instead engineered an inventive coup de théâtre. At the moment that the gun went off, a bank of photographers' flashbulbs were placed along the edge of the stage, and they all exploded right in the audience's eyes, momentarily blinding everyone. The tabletop in the middle of the stage was rigged to flip over during that moment, whisking away all the plates and food from Act 1 and leaving behind only a bare surface. And during those same few seconds, all the actors slipped off stage. And when the audience looked up, suddenly the world was transformed. Now, during intermission, this effect was all the audience could talk about, at least until the second act started. Because in this part of Pour Bitos, the actors returned, and now they were all dressed as famous historical personages from the infamous Committee of Public Safety during the French Revolution. Bitos, played by Georges Bartenieff, was now Robespierre. Other actors were Desmoulins, Tallien, Mirabeau, and Saint-Just. Sally Kirkland was Queen Marie Antoinette, and Madame Tallien was played by Flora Elkins. This character was based on a historical person who was known for publicly wearing revealing clothing that freed her body, and a note to that effect was inserted in the program. The latter woman's costume, designed by Adam Sage, was rather modeled after the famous painting of Marianne, the Spirit of France, in Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix. And though in that painting, Marianne is fully topless, in this costume, Elkins had one breast showing, fully exposed. Well, now you can guess pretty much what everybody in the audience was talking about after Act 2. Delacroix's painting is about the Revolution of 1830, not the Revolution of 1789. My gosh, what an embarrassing historical howler. As a former college history major and a devoted fan of Mike Duncan's podcast Revolutions, I share their outrage all these years later. No, just kidding. Of course, everybody was talking about the breast, and nobody cared about which French Revolution was being referenced. Well, clearly the sexual revolution had come to Philadelphia theater at long last. Anyway, to this day, in fact, in Philadelphia, if anyone remembers anything at all about Andre Gregory's tenure at the Theater of the Living Arts, they mention that one exposed body part every time. And it's not really surprising. Just imagine what our old friend, the Reverend Frederick Poole, would have said about this happening on a Philadelphia stage. And just imagine the report that our other old friend, Police Detective Jacob Gombrov, would have written. And we can also imagine how delighted our old friend, the opera singer Mary Garden, would have been at the whole spectacle. Even though attitudes and laws had changed in the city of Philadelphia since those days. Apparently, officially, the theater management did have to notify the Philadelphia police about it. And every night, during the second act of Poor Betos, a couple of officers would show up at the back of the house, walk inside, and observe, just to make sure that that single naked female bosom was being used as part of a artistic production and not displayed otherwise for lewd or lascivious purposes. And apparently the Philly PD officers were altogether delighted with their nightly assignment and were rather disappointed when Poor Betos finally ended its run. Now, this show as a whole attracted huge amounts of national critical attention to Philadelphia, though I can note that almost nobody in any of their reviews mentions that exposed breast. All the critics were trying to be sophisticated. The swinging 60s were well underway. It would just not be cool. Even when Stanley Kaufman himself, then the leading critic for the New York Times, came down to Philadelphia just to see that show, he didn't write a word about it in his review, except elliptically. He referenced Gregory's fondness for what he called startling effects. Stanley Kaufman published these thoughts in a major article in the Sunday edition of the Times in April of 1966, along with his roundup of other recent plays he had seen in other American regional theaters. Kaufman declared that the TLA production of Poor Betos was infinitely more interesting than the ones he had seen staged in London and in New York, and that overall, the abilities of the Southwark Acting Company was actually higher than those of the other professional companies he had seen. In this article, one thing that Kaufman advised Gregory and the other talented directors at American regional theaters to do, if they wanted to keep their artistry fresh and keep their audiences moving along with them in their efforts to create a new American theater, he said, don't just mount prestigious European works like Poor Betos. Stage new American plays. Quote, theaters don't want to be museums of drama, no matter how fine their repertories are. They know that their health depends, in some measure, on sharp, contemporary American pertinence. Close quotes. And further, Kaufman asserted that there ought to be less people coming into New York to see shows and more trains and buses going out of New York City to go and see what was going on in places like Philadelphia every week. And in fact, though Kaufman didn't know it at the time, that was already happening. On the closing night of Poor Betos, a Baltimore Sun reviewer came up to Philadelphia, and he was amazed to find several members of the British cast of the Royal Shakespeare Company's Mara Sad, which was then performing on Broadway, in the audience in Philadelphia at the TLA. These British actors had heard great things about Poor Betos, which, after all, was set in the same historical period as their own show, and which was, let us remember, directed by the same Peter Brook, who had been frustrated by his own failure to excite the imaginations of the Philadelphia crowd with his King Lear 2 years before. And though he wasn't there, no doubt he heard about it, maybe he thought that Andre Gregory was onto something big. The TLA's second season concluded in May 1966 with a production of The Last Analysis by novelist Saul Bellow, an American writer this time, but again, it was a restaging of a work that had previously failed on Broadway. David Hearst led the company as an aging famous comedian named Philip Bummy Bummage, who produces a closed-circuit TV show about his life and his complex inner psyche. His audience for this show was a group of leading psychiatrists at a professional conference who munch on caviar and drink champagne while they comment on the spectacle they're watching. In the cast were Sylvia Gassel, as Bummy's wife, Lois Smith as his mistress, Ruth Baker as his sister, Flora Elkins as his secretary, Jerry Dempsey as his lawyer, and Ron Liebman played his son. The reviews for this show in the local papers, again, were generally complimentary. In the Philadelphia Daily News, reviewer Jack Helsel wrote, "You can't get the whole public on a couch, but that's what they're doing nightly at the Living Arts with The Last Analysis, which, in The Last Analysis, is an eavesdropping, educational, and entertaining evening." Well, elated by the success of this entire second season, Andre Gregory announced to the press that next year he was planning to expand the season from 5 shows, running 5 weeks each, to 6 shows, running 6 weeks each, and he was going to give the acting company 6 weeks of rehearsal, and he was going to expand this permanent acting company from its now 12 to 17 members, and he was going to give them what amounted to almost year-round work. Gregory also announced that he was about to take the TLA's production of Endgame from the previous year to New Haven, Connecticut, at the invitation of Robert Brustein, the new dean of the Yale Drama School, to launch the season of its new repertory company. And perhaps influenced by Stanley Kaufman's advice in the New York Times, Gregory was already planning his 3rd season that was going to begin in October 1965, and this would consist of entirely American plays and playwrights. $100,000 had just come in for the TLA from the National Endowment of the Arts, and he was going to begin a $2 million fundraising drive to create an entirely new theater space within the next 6 years. And maybe soon, he thought, they would have the personnel and the facilities to become a true repertory company with a changing bill of performances every night, just like the old Moscow Art Theater. It was just mind-boggling, but maybe it was possible. The Inquirer editorial board wrote an editorial praising what the Theater of the Living Arts and Andre Gregory had accomplished in just a short time of 2 years, and they urged Philadelphians to support that effort with their money and with their patronage. Everything was going so well, right? In the midst of all this good news, I am going to report there were also several troubling indications that not all was well at the little theater that could on South Street. First, Associate Artistic Director George Sherman, who usually handled the comic side of the season and was the gregarious and the comforting mother of the company, suddenly announced that he was leaving for artistic reasons. He wouldn't say anything more definite. It was all very strange. And although this sudden departure was handled rather deftly and quietly, in public at least, backstage, well, the knives were suddenly out. Boardroom politics, especially at this nonprofit theater, got quite ugly. First, in a pure power play, Andre Gregory persuaded his allies on the board to greatly expand the number of voting members, admitting all sorts of new people. And when he had done so, one of the first things he did was to use this new majority to vote to remove anyone who had consistently been opposing his ideas about his repertoire for his upcoming All-American season. And guess who these recalcitrant stick-in-the-muds were? Well, it was the Silvermans and the Goldmans, the 2 couples who had founded the theater in the first place 2 years before. Well, this was just an astounding and heartbreaking development, as you might imagine. Though, as we shall see next time, it was not at all unusual for nonprofit theater board politics of that day. Striking back, Fred Goldman issued a formal report that he had evidently been working on for months in case something like this should happen. And in this report, he charged Andre Gregory and Managing Director David Lunney with gross fiscal incompetence and mismanagement. Due to extravagant spending, Goldman said, the TLA's deficit had grown from the first season. It was not being made up at all. It was expanding, despite all these new grants and gift revenues. Now, the new board was just a rubber stamp for Gregory, and it couldn't see the danger ahead, said Goldman. They were so dazzled by Gregory's aura. In fact, accused Goldman, Andre Gregory was exhibiting dictatorial tendencies. With all this recent success, nobody was going to be allowed to stand in his way. Maybe this was why George Sherman had left, he intimated. The artistic director was no longer going to be committing to a theater of ideas, and the TLA was being steered away from the old communitarian hedgerow theater model of group consensus. Andre Gregory wanted to take the theater in a different direction entirely. Like Peter Brook's highly influential and successful show, Marat Sade, he was going to attack the smug pieties of the Philadelphia audience, who were instead going to be exposed to an Artodian theater of cruelty. Gregory wanted to do plays of sex and violence, and rather than cater to the old crowd, he wanted to attract a new kind of audience: homosexuals, drug addicts, and would-be suicides. Well, how true were these accusations? Was this fair? And would Fred Goldman's charges bring down Andre Gregory's supposedly dictatorial regime? Would there be a third season at all? Would the theater of the living arts become a byword in American theater, or an ominous warning about the future direction of the entire American regional theater movement and the nonprofit theater in Philadelphia? But here comes the phrase. Find out next time in what I promise, really, truly promise. No backsies this time. I'm going to do it. This will be the thrilling conclusion of our Season 2, Drama is Conflict. Once again, if you're enjoying our work here and you have just a few extra minutes, please, please, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this show. Plus, and I really mean this, write to us. Let us know what you're thinking. Our email is aithpodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us right through our website, www.aithpodcast.com. In the show notes to this episode, you can find a link to our Patreon account and to a blog post about this show on the public website, free for everybody. There's all sorts of extra information and additional material there. We appreciate your attention and we appreciate your support. Thank you, everyone, for listening today and for coming along on yet another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.